Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're going to be doing an updated presidential election prediction between Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump. But before I start, I'd like to say if you like my content, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you know when we upload, and also leave a like and comment. With that said, let's get into it. So, as always, I'm going to start by filling in the solid Republican states, and those are going to be Montana, Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, North and South Dakota, Nebraska's 3rd and the 1st congressional district, as well as the state at large, Kansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Iowa, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, Indiana, West Virginia, Ohio, and South Carolina. Next, I'm going to fill in the solid states for Kamala Harris. Those are going to be Washington, Oregon, California, Hawaii, Colorado, and New Mexico, Illinois, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, and Maine's 1st congressional district, and D.C. Next, I'm going to fill in the likely states for Donald Trump, starting with the state of Alaska. Alaska is a state that used to be ruby red, but every year since 2008, it has trended towards the Democrats. In 2020, Donald Trump only won it by around 11 points. So I do think that trend is going to continue. So I do think the margin is going to fall below 10 points. So I'm calling Alaska likely Republican. Next up is going to be the state of Texas. Texas is another state that in recent years has trended towards Democrats. In 2012, Mitt Romney won it by 16 points. Then in 2016, Donald Trump only won it by 9 points, which was the smallest win for a Republican in years. Then in 2020, he won it by an even smaller margin of 5.5 points. And it was expected to be a lot closer than that in 2020. But the reason Trump did so well in Texas relative to the expectations was because he did a lot better with Hispanic voters than was expected. So even though the suburbs and other areas that are trending towards Democrats did trend towards them in Texas in 2020, he did a lot better with Hispanic voters in the Rio Grande Valley and the other parts of South Texas. So he was able to hang on to the margin there. And according to current polling, it looks like he's going to do even better with Hispanic voters in 2024. And in Texas polling, he's currently leading by around 6 points, which was a little more than he won it by in 2020. I do think those polls are going to be fairly accurate, so I am going to call Texas likely Republican. Next up is going to be the state of Florida. Florida is really the opposite of Texas in that it has been becoming a lot more Republican in recent years. In 2016, Donald Trump only won it by a point over Hillary Clinton. Then in 2020, against most predictions, Trump actually won Florida and won it by a larger margin than in 2016. He won it by over 3 points, which was the largest margin for any candidate in Florida since 2004. And much like Texas, part of the reason Trump was able to do so well in Florida is because he's doing better with Hispanic voters, especially Cuban Americans. And there are a lot of Cuban Americans in Florida, so that's part of why he did so well. But also, the state is just trending towards Republicans overall. In 2022, DeSantis won by almost 20 points in the governor election, and Marco Rubio won by over 16 points in the Senate election. And polling currently has Donald Trump winning Florida by around 6 points. So I am going to call Florida likely Republican. I do think Trump does a little better than that. I think he probably wins by like 8 to 9. So I am going to call Florida likely Republican. And finally, we're going to call Maine's 2nd congressional district likely Republican. This is one that Donald Trump flipped in 2016 from Obama. He won it by 10 points in 2016. Then in 2020, he won it by 7 points. So I do think he's going to win it again by a pretty decent margin. So I am going to call it likely Republican. Next, I'm going to fill in the likely Democrat states for Kamala Harris, and I'm going to start with Nebraska's 2nd congressional district. So Donald Trump actually won Nebraska's 2nd congressional district against Hillary Clinton in 2016. He won it by around 2 points. Then in 2020, Joe Biden won it by a whopping 6.5 points. And that's because the suburbs of Omaha are in Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, and the suburbs are where Donald Trump has done the worst relative to Republicans in the past. And I'm expecting that to kind of accelerate in 2024. It's not going to be as big of a shift from 2016 to 2020, but I am expecting that Trump will do worse in the suburbs. So even though this district did get more Republican with redistricting, I think it's probably going to be a similar margin to 2020, and polls have been showing that too. So I am calling it likely Democrat. Next up is going to be the state of Minnesota. Minnesota is a state that Hillary Clinton came dangerously close to losing in 2016. She only won it by around 1.5 points. But the reason for that was because there was a lot of third-party vote in 2016. Hillary Clinton won the state 46 to 44, so there was almost 90% third party in 2016. Then in 2020, the state was expected to be relatively close, and then Biden ended up winning it by over 7 points because it just kind of reverted back to the blue state it usually was, and there was not as much third party turnout. And there's not supposed to be as much third party turnout in 2024 either, especially now that RFK has dropped out and endorsed Trump. And Minnesota is also the home state of Kamala Harris's running mate, Tim Walz. So I do think they're going to win Minnesota by a similar margin to 2020, so I am going to call it likely Democrat. Next up is going to be the state of New Hampshire. New Hampshire, similar to Minnesota. In 2016, it was very close. I think it was the closest state in the election, or maybe the second closest. Hillary Clinton won it by a very tight margin. And then in 2020, it voted for Joe Biden by over 7 points. New Hampshire seems to be a state that's getting bluer and bluer. It used to be pretty reliably Republican, but it seems to not be a huge fan of the Trump brand of republicanism that has taken over the Republican Party in recent years. So I do expect it to go a little more Democrat than last time. So I am going to call it likely Democrat. Similarly, Maine was pretty close in 2016, a lot closer than anyone thought it was going to be. Hillary Clinton only won it by around 2 points. Then in 2020, Joe Biden won it by 9. I think, again, it's going to be a convincing victory for Kamala Harris, so I'm calling it likely Democrat. So now that I filled in all of the solid and likely states for each candidate, we have Kamala Harris starting at 213 and Donald Trump starting at 219. So now I'm going to go through all of the toss-up states, west to east, starting with the state of Nevada. So Nevada is a state that ever since 2008 has been trending more and more towards Republicans. In 2016, Donald Trump won it by around 2.4%, or excuse me, Hillary Clinton won it by around 2.4% over Donald Trump. Then in 2020, it was almost an identical margin to 2016. Joe Biden won it by slightly less than 2.4%. So Nevada technically trended right in 2020, especially when the entire country trended left. That was not very expected. So Nevada has been trending towards Republicans. And in 2022, Republicans were supposed to win the Nevada Senate race and governor race. They did end up winning the governor race by a narrow margin, but the Senate race ended up going to Democrats. And that's important because in most states in 2016 and 2020, Donald Trump was underestimated. He ended up doing better in the final results than the polls were showing. However, in 2016, Nevada was one of the few states that had him doing pretty well in polling, and then he ended up losing it. So Nevada does tend to underestimate Democrats in its polling. Right now, Kamala Harris in both the RCP and 538 averages is leading by around 1.5 points. I do think that Nevada is going to be close. For a while, I thought this was going to be the year that Nevada finally flipped to the Republicans on the presidential level. But because of recent polling and Kamala Harris's momentum since she announced her campaign, I do think that Nevada is going to stay in the Democratic column very narrowly. So I'm going to call it tilt Democrat. Next up is going to be the state of Arizona. And in recent presidential elections, Arizona has been going kind of the opposite way of Nevada. In 2008, John McCain won it by a pretty large margin, and it was his home state. Then in 2012, Mitt Romney won it by around 9 points. Then in 2016, Donald Trump only won it by around 3 points. And so that was really one of the first signs that Arizona was trending towards Democrats. Then in the 2018 midterms, Democrats flipped the Senate seat in Arizona. And then finally in 2020, Joe Biden narrowly won the state over Donald Trump. And a big reason for that is because Maricopa County, which is the home of Phoenix, trended towards Democrats. Joe Biden became the first Democrat to win it since the 1940s. And that's mostly because of the suburban trends that I mentioned earlier that are happening against Trump. However, polling has shown Arizona to be one of Donald Trump's best swing states, maybe the best now. And I think a big reason for that is because immigration and the border has become such a huge issue in this election, and Arizona is a border state. So Donald Trump has been doing very well in the polling in Arizona recently. Right now, he's up 1 to 2 points, depending on what polling averages you look at. I do think Donald Trump is going to win Arizona, so I am going to call it lean Republican. Next up is going to be the state of Wisconsin. And Wisconsin is a state that went from voting Obama twice to voting Trump in 2016 and then back to voting for Joe Biden in 2020. So it is really the quintessential swing state. In 2016, Donald Trump won it by around 0.7. And then in 2020, Joe Biden won it by an even smaller 0.6% margin. Right now, Kamala Harris is leading the polls in Wisconsin very narrowly. On RCP, she's leading by a little under a point. And on 538, she's leading by around 1.5 points. And mentioning the polling in Wisconsin is really important because in 2016 and 2020, the final error in polling in Wisconsin overestimated the Democratic candidates by around 6 points each. So Hillary Clinton was supposed to win it by like 5 or 6 points, and then Trump ended up winning it. Biden was supposed to win it by like 7 points. He won it by a little less than 1 point. And so there are usually huge misses in Wisconsin. At least there have been both times Donald Trump hasn't been on the ballot. And there's no guarantee that that's going to happen again. But I do think it's important to note that polling in Wisconsin, it's just really hard to poll the state. And in 2022, polling was off in the opposite direction. Tony Evers was supposed to lose that race, and he ended up winning it by like 3 points. And Ron Johnson only won by a point in the Senate race, the Republican, when he was supposed to win by like 5 or 6 points. Overall, I don't think the polling error is going to be as big as it was in 2016 or 2020, but I do still think that Donald Trump is going to pull off the state. So I'm going to call Wisconsin tilt Republican. Next up is going to be the state of Michigan. And Michigan is another state that went for Obama twice, then Trump in 2016, and then Biden in 2020. It wasn't quite as close in 2020 as Wisconsin was. It voted for Biden by around 2.5 points. In 2016, it was the closest state to vote for Trump. And currently, polling has Harris up by around 1.5 points in the state of Michigan. Just like Wisconsin, there are pretty big polling errors in Michigan, not as big as Wisconsin, but Hillary Clinton was supposed to win the state of Michigan pretty convincingly in 2016, and then she ended up losing it. And in 2020, Biden was supposed to do a lot better than 2.5 points. I'm not expecting a huge polling miss in Michigan again. I do think it's going to be very close, but I do still think that Kamala Harris is going to narrowly pull it off, so I am going to call it tilt Democrat. Next up is going to be the state of Georgia. Georgia has been trending towards Democrats for a while now. In 2016, Donald Trump won it by 5 points, which was a decrease from the margin that Mitt Romney won it by. Then in 2020, it had a huge shift against Donald Trump, and Biden actually ended up winning it by a fraction of a percentage point. And a big part of that is because the Atlanta metro area is growing and the suburbs are turning against Donald Trump. However, polling has been pretty good for Trump so far this cycle. Against Biden, he was doing very well in Georgia. It's narrowed up against Kamala Harris, but he is still winning the polls in Georgia by around 1.5 points. And in 2020, the polls were actually very good in Georgia. In most states, they missed by several points, but in Georgia, it was really within the margin of error. And Biden was very narrowly leading the polls on election day and then ended up narrowly winning the state. Even though Georgia did go to the Democrats in 2020, in 2022, the Republican governor, Brian Kemp, won re-election by around 7 points, which was a pretty big margin of victory. But Herschel Walker, the Republican nominee for Senate, did lose to the Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock in a runoff, but that was still a very close race. So Georgia is still winnable for Republicans. And right now it does look like Donald Trump is going to eke out the state of Georgia because polling in Georgia in recent years has been one of the most accurate states. So I do think Trump's going to narrowly take Georgia, so I'm going to call it tilt Republican. Next up is going to be the state of North Carolina. And North Carolina is one of the only swing states that Donald Trump actually won both times. In fact, it's the only one of the toss-up states that I have here that Donald Trump won in both 2016 and 2020. Right now, he's up very narrowly in the polls. It's actually closer than Georgia, even though North Carolina went to Donald Trump in 2020 and Georgia didn't. And I don't expect North Carolina to vote to the left of Georgia this time, even though the polls are showing it, because in 2020, the polls showed the same thing. They showed that North Carolina was going to be even more Democratic than Georgia, but then Georgia ended up flipping to Biden and North Carolina didn't. And in 2022, the Senate race was to the right of Georgia's Senate race. So I do think that North Carolina is a more Republican state at this point than Georgia is, despite what the polling is saying. But it is interesting that recent polling has shown North Carolina to be very close. And a lot of polling has actually shown Harris to be winning North Carolina, but a lot of polling showed that last time too. I don't think North Carolina is going to flip, but I do think it's going to be really close this election, maybe around the same margin as Georgia, but I think it'll probably be a little more Republican than Georgia. Either way, I am going to be calling it tilt Republican. All right, so next up is going to be the state of Virginia. Despite a lot of polling in certain states showing Harris to be outperforming Joe Biden's 2020 numbers, Virginia's polling has actually been consistently a lot closer than 2020. Right now in 538, Harris is leading by around 6, and in Real Clear Politics, Harris is leading by less than 5. And I do think that Virginia 2020 was a bit of a fluke. In 2020, Joe Biden won Virginia by 10 points, which was a very large margin and was a little bit bigger than I think most people expected in Virginia. In 2016, Hillary Clinton only won the state of Virginia by 5 points, and that was with Tim Kaine on the ballot, who is from Virginia. And of course, in 2021, a Republican actually won the governor election, Glenn Youngkin, in a minor upset. So Virginia is probably not as blue as the 2020 election made it seem. I don't think that Donald Trump's going to win it, but I do think it's probably going to revert a little bit back to being more of a swingy state. I do think Harris is still going to win it by a couple points, probably 4 to 5 points. So I'm going to call Virginia lean Democrat. So finally, we have the keystone state of Pennsylvania. And right now in polling, Pennsylvania is a dead heat. In Real Clear Politics average, Donald Trump is leading very narrowly. And in the 538 average, Kamala Harris is leading very narrowly. This is a state that, just like Wisconsin and Michigan, voted for Obama twice, then narrowly flipped to Donald Trump before flipping back to Joe Biden in 2020. And even in 2020, it was very close. Joe Biden won it by a little over 1 point. And in 2016, Donald Trump won it by a little under 1 point. So the last several elections, Pennsylvania has been super close, and it looks like it's going to be again. It's another state where, when Donald Trump has been on the ballot, Republicans have been underestimated. He was not supposed to win the state against Hillary Clinton in 2016, but he did. And in 2020, when Joe Biden won the state, it was supposed to be by a much larger margin. However, in 2022, polls did overestimate Republicans in the state. Josh Shapiro won by a way bigger margin than anyone expected. And in the final weeks of the election, Dr. Oz took a lead in the polls and then ended up losing by almost 5 points. So in 2022, it was the opposite. But every time Trump has been on the ballot, the polls have underestimated him in Pennsylvania. Voter registration numbers also look very good for Republicans in Pennsylvania. So it could be the case again that Trump is being underestimated in Pennsylvania polling. Overall, I do think it's going to be close, but I do think Trump is going to narrowly win Pennsylvania, so I'm going to call it tilt Republican. So now, with all these states filled in on the map, I have Donald Trump winning re-election to a second non-consecutive term with 291 electoral votes to Vice President Kamala Harris's 247. Overall, this election has really narrowed up since Joe Biden dropped out and Kamala Harris started campaigning for her own campaign. But I do still think Donald Trump has the narrow edge based on current polling trends and errors of the past. A lot of these states, especially the tilt states, I could see going either way. But for now, I do think that Donald Trump is going to win the 2024 election. And thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you like my content, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you know when we upload. Also, leave a like and comment and tell me what you agreed with and what you disagreed with. And with that said, thank you guys so much for watching and have a great day.